Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for a conversation on US-China science cooperation and Chinese-American scientists in the Trump 2.0 era. I'm Mihaela Papa, Director of Research and Principal Research Scientist at the MIT Center for International Studies. Our center recently introduced Global Research and Policy Seminars, a series designed to address current challenges in global development and governance, to explore innovative policy approaches and provide expert insights on emerging international trends. And this is our first seminar of the semester. President Trump has staged an extraordinary comeback, and he's currently pursuing his political agenda with great energy, with ambition and determination. His administration has introduced numerous new initiatives and executive orders, and a new team is now in place. As this administration shapes its China policy, how is the United States navigating scientific collaboration with China? What are the implications for Chinese American and China-focused scientists? To explore these questions and help us navigate the evolving dynamics, we have invited experts with extensive experience in US-China collaborations across engineering, social sciences, and science policy to share their insights. Our agenda today includes presentations from our speakers, around 10 minutes each, followed by a conversation and question and answer. Please have your question ready. We are also recording this event. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers in the order of their presentations. So to start us off, Chen will introduce his work. And he is the Carl Richard Soderberg Professor of Power Engineering at the MIT Department of Mechanical Engineering and the Director of Pappalardo Micro and Nano Engineering Laboratories. David Goldstone is the Director of the MIT Washington office. He will go then, and he plays a key role in keeping the MIT campus informed about policy developments in DC, and helps shape MIT's policy positions and communications on federal matters. And then Yasheng Huang is the Epoch Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at MIT Sloan School of Management and Faculty Director of the MIT China Program at the Center for International Studies. So please join me in welcoming our stellar panel.
Thank you, Mihaela. And I do give talks with slides, and I don't know how to give talks without slides. So it is a presentation. And I think, I'm here, really many of you know my experience. This was just 6 days, before Trump, Trump era 1, right, before he left, the president office. I was arrested under China Initiative, and I really stayed at home for, over a year. In January 2022, DOJ dropped all charges against me. So since then, I've been doing a lot of advocacy work, working with government mostly through a nonprofit organization, Asian American Scholar Forum. Yasheng is actually president of the forum. So I will share some of the observations because today is more focused on Trump 2.0 era, and it just gets started, so I can't make too much predictions. So I will talk about what I've seen over last few years. So let's go to the next slide. I always like to give a title, but this title is what I've been using. It's really for this community doing research in fear in US. And, but let me start with really MIT saved me. My colleagues here, MIT leadership all support me, and that saved me. So I won't talk too much on that. And it will go from, say, in January 2022, DOJ dropped my case. In February 2022, DOJ terminated China Initiative. So at that time, say MIT Technology Review asked the question, now what, right? And say Matt Elson, Assistant Attorney General at the time, he stated, say the China Initiative, help give rise to a harmful perception that DOJ apply a lower standard to investigate and prosecute criminal conducts related to the country. So at the time, I was really angry. I know, learned later, it was not easy even for him to say this. It was not perception, it was real, okay? And so what happened, right? The reality is, even after DOJ terminated China Initiative, the prosecution continued. And one example is Professor Franklin Tao from Kansas University. And he was the first one indicted under China Initiative, and he fought 5 years. 5 years, and it was only last year in July, his case was finally dropped from, say, the court went to the, I don't even know how, circular court, the district court to circular court. And a case like this costs several $1 million. And he is over $1 million behind, right? And I sometimes help him in fundraising, and we raise almost, or say, over $1 million, but he's still over $1 million behind. And in fact, he tried to get his job back from University of Kansas, and they actually threatened him. And so, he had to, at the end, he's filing a lawsuit against the university. He didn't want to. He just wanted to get his job back, and the university didn't support him. So, and this is really the agencies are still continuing investigation and prosecution of researchers had connection with China. Many of them, of course, say has Chinese heritage. And NIH is one example, and this was an article in Science, March 2023, and it gave statistics, right? 103 people lost their job, and 156 people were removed, and 81% of them are, say, of Asian heritage. And this was a congressional hearing by Mike Lauer, who is the NIH director in 2024. He said that since 2018, NIH has received the allegations involving over 600 scientists, wherein Office of Extramural Research have contact institutions in 255 cases. Nonetheless, it is important to keep in mind that fewer than 1% of the approximately 40,000 NIH-funded principal investigator scientists have been linked to foreign interference concern. When I listen to this, it reminds me of McCarthy waving a blank sheet of paper, said that I have names of 205 who are communists, 205. And he's saying this is only just less than 1%. And think about the damage to the country. And the NIH is just one agency, and there are many other agencies. And in fact, I know a faculty member, another university, right? And she said her NSF grant was stopped, and she reported her funding from China to Army Research Office, and her assistant thought that she didn't need to report to NSF because it already past time. And NSF stopped her funding and did not give her a chance to explain, right? And there are many examples like this. I have colleagues that say said that his proposal was basically put out of DOE review. Then even last year, right, colleagues said they were funded by DOE, but they had to go back 10 years and report that every trip they made to China and who gave the money. How could you remember 10 years back, right? So those are all the current investigations. And really, the border remains a place of terror for many people, researchers, and particularly researchers, students of Chinese origin. These were the two articles last year in Nature and Science. Right? Nature talked about the faculty get investigated. And in fact, one of the anonymous story was a colleague at MIT. Right? He entered U.S. He went to Canada for a conference. And we know return from Canada is intern from Canada side, right? And he was asked a few questions at the Canada border, got in on the airplane, and once they landed in Chicago, and the pilot asked everybody, took out the passport, and two agents were at the airport, at the gate, and took him to the dock room and interrogated a few hours. And because he had a few papers years back, several years back, that had Chinese co-author. Those were so once you say it's anonymous, people are afraid to talk about, right? And 2 years ago, on January 1st, I got a panic call from a colleague because the two visitors from China, and she was waiting for them at the airport and didn't show up. They didn't show up after 30 hours. And 40 hours later, they got a call from China, they were sent back. And this happened often at the airport, right? And people, once they got investigated or this happened, if they have a lawyer say, don't talk to anybody. So we don't hear this. We do not hear this. And it's happening even last December. A colleague at Harvard, a faculty member at Harvard, called me, and his cell phone and his computer were taken away at Logan Airport, right? Those are just a daily experience of the people. And what's worse is you see a lot of those investigation, and this is written in the law. It's codified in the CHIPS Act. You can see the definition of mainland foreign talent program, and basically say any appointment, honorific, travel, and complimentary foreign travel, right? And no matter what value, right? None the minimum value. And if this appointment asks you to do those, right? Of course, IP transfer, unauthorized IP transfer, and being required to recruit trainee or researcher enrolled in such program. For faculty, what if you write a recommendation letter, right? You look at this definition, Elon Musk will fall into mainland foreign talent program definition. They will not go prosecute Elon Musk. So because it's written in the law, all the agencies will comply. So they will do the regulations, and this is, in fact, the one that I'm showing is DOD. DOD is the most open, right? They actually talk to us, and we give feedback. But even at the end, if you look at what's published, I'm not going to, I know you can't read, but I just want to point out one example. This is one we push really hard, right? Mitigation measures suggest that DOD say we want to encourage collaboration, right? But they say here, if you publish a paper 2019 after, right, cover individual co-authors on publication in scientific engineering journals who are participating in the mainland foreign talent program, you need to mitigate the risk. We say, you're right there, nobody will collaborate, right? Why I want to have this kind of risk? It's in the document, it's online. And NSF, right, it's data-driven. And if you look at the trust process, decision process, and at the end it's considering data analytics, so we're talking to NSF. All those agencies, the most important thing we say, you need to give researchers an opportunity to defend themselves. There's no such process, no procedures in the current policy on that, right? So really, this is the asymmetry, right? We know the government has so much power come to a university, and like Mike Lauer say, I'll stop your funding, NIH funding, the entire university. What they can do, everybody's afraid, right? So it's such a power asymmetry between government and university and faculty, right? So we have heard many examples. Program managers don't allow the researcher go attend any conference in China, right? And university, say we have colleagues here just to say they don't dare go back, right? They don't dare go back to visit their family. They don't dare to go back to even to their university and talk to anybody. And so faculty will self-censor, right? And so collaboration, it's almost like a what collaboration, right? It's disappearing. And I was in China attending a field conference because I don't go government funding anymore, and there are no people, 1 or 2 people from US, right? International conference. So student recruiting, and I put a faculty, say, recruiting mark. And so let me just quickly go, this is coming back. China Initiative is coming back, right? Last September, I was in Congress. This was the day before the vote. And this is the vote of a new bill, 1398 in the House. And basically say, Biden terminated China Initiative. We are now calling it the CCP Initiative. And if you look at this, what it say is develop an enforcement strategy concerning non-traditional collectors. Wei grew up in China and has a Chinese name, non-traditional collectors. And including researchers in universities, labs, and defense industry base. It's targeting academia, right? And this is what the recent hearing by say Senator Jim Rich, and he said every Chinese student is a spy. And can we just play this video?
And one of the ones I've been focused on over the years and have been somewhat successful, but not completely successful, is to get a better handle on what colleges and universities are doing. The colleges and universities, as all of you know, are a really target-rich place for the Chinese. They show up with money, and as was pointed out here, colleges and universities respond to money, whether from their donors, from their alumni, or from the Chinese showing up with money. And most Americans are shocked to hear that we have hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying here in the United States, with only a tiny, tiny fraction of US students studying in China. And there's a huge difference. The Chinese students here are not studying ancient Greek history. They're here with the STEMs and the national security issues and everything else. And each and every one of them, whether they like it or not, is an agent of the Chinese Communist Party. When they go back, we all know they get debriefed, and, and any information that they've garnered here in the United States becomes the property of the Chinese Communist Party.
Really, this created such a fear in the scientific community. This was a survey conducted a few years ago. I don't think it changed. It's going worse probably. And really, say, if you look at the over 70% of people living in fear. This is in the United States of America, in our country, right? And people want to contribute to science, but doing research become a high-risk profession. And I'm not going to spend time on this, but say I do want to give this example. One, those both are very personal, right? Chen was our student. He was a professor at Caltech, and he also was a professor at MIT for a short time. And under McCarthy, he was arrested 5 years, house arrest, 5 years. And he went back to China and started China's rocket industry. My own PhD advisor, Chen was UC Berkeley chancellor. He was investigated. In fact, there was a report on that, and he was a target for many years, right? And really the danger is the brain drain, right? The brain gain, there are, say, quotes. I'm just going to say the quote here by Jonathan Cole. American research university rise to global preeminence was a recent, highly contingent development that was largely a byproduct of the influx of foreign scholars during the 1930s and 1940s, and the ravages wrought on European university by the World War II. And then Stephen Mintz wrote, universities can improve rapidly, but they can also decline quickly. And if you look at the OECD data, right, this is the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and this is the international net flow of scientific authors. So it's a new addition of authors. And if you look at data, this is US, it's been gaining, and 2018, and now, so 2018 is over 4,000 positive gain. 2021, it becomes negative. We are hurting the country. So with that, let me stop here. I just want to say that I do the advocacy through nonprofit, so I make it clear to MIT this is outside some of the work, and when I go to lobby in Congress, that's not the MIT lobby. Thank you.
Hi. This is on, I gather? Yeah. So I'm David Goldston. I'm the director of MIT Washington office, as Mihaela said earlier. I guess when I talk to Washington, it actually is lobbying, although not all the time. So let me give sort of a broad picture of the current context, and then maybe in the back and forth we can talk about how it fits in with what Gang said and what Yasheng may say. So the first thing to know is that China and its impact on US security and economic competitiveness is a bipartisan issue. So we're talking about this, as we should, in the context of the new Trump administration, but concern about China is actually one of the few things probably that there's almost complete bipartisan consensus on in terms of China as the nature of the threat, challenge, competition. The words might differ, and the words can make a difference, that China poses to the US. The solutions to that may be different by party, and even there are different factions, as I'll talk about, within the parties, but the sense that China represents a fundamental challenge to the US geopolitically, economically, and in terms of military is, again, broadly accepted. And this change in seeing China primarily through that lens really started in the second Obama administration. It didn't start with Trump. And one thing that a Democratic congressional staffer said to me once, who was a China expert, is that he couldn't think of another time, at least in recent US history, where the US did face a challenger that was simultaneously military, economic, and ideological, right? The Soviets were an ideological threat. We didn't really worry about and military. We didn't worry about their economy very much. In the 80s, we thought the Japanese were an economic threat. We didn't worry about their ideology or their military, which wasn't even existing very much at that point. China presents this unique problem, and frankly, we just haven't really figured out what to do about that. That's why we have political scientists to help figure that out. I say as someone who was a history major. So that's number one. The other thing to remember is that, and Yasheng and I were on a panel the other night that Gang helped organize, and we spent an hour talking about these issues without probably ever mentioning China itself in terms of, so I think it's also important to recognize, and Yasheng is the expert here on this, but this isn't just happening in a vacuum, although it's affected by US politics and concerns. The shift in US policy happened largely in response to Xi Jinping. Whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent, or a mix, it was reacting, and indeed some of the things that Gang talked about in terms of trends in collaboration, the decline in collaboration is definitely partly because of US policy, but it's also sometimes fostered by Chinese policy. So where do we go from here? As Gang mentioned, it's early, but you can only predict the future. Everything else you already know. So I would say it's actually become harder in recent weeks to predict where this stands, I think. So we know that Trump liked to do a lot of saber rattling about China during the campaign and just overall. But there's been some articles and so forth wondering if, for whatever reason, I'll suggest one, that he's been softening on China in terms of going more slowly on tariffs, not moving immediately on things like the China Initiative, not talking as much about China as he is about what most of us would view as our allies. And generally, the thinking is that this could be a result of the way he is now surrounded by people from big tech, Elon Musk and others, and which is an entirely different political alignment than occurred in the first Trump administration. The one case where that's almost fact is in terms of his 180-degree turn on TikTok, which was almost certainly because of tech company people talking to him. 180-degree turn separate from actually what was required by a bipartisan passed law by Congress. So it's a little unclear where Trump is personally on this. The other thing is that there are factions in both parties, and there are certainly factions in the Republican Party. There are people like Stephen Miller, one of Trump's top advisors, who was in the first Trump administration also, who, as far as anyone knows, would love to just ban all Chinese students, would like to ban all kinds of legal and immigrants, and certainly undocumented. In the first administration, he interestingly lost that battle because the US ambassador to China at the time, who had been governor of Iowa, said, if you ban Chinese students, you're going to kill Iowa. Because of most of those 300,000 or so Chinese students are actually undergraduates, and at large Midwestern universities, they're one of the revenue sources that keeps them going these days. And also the same for those college towns. So Miller lost that then. Now we can see the same kind of debate again between Miller and that faction and the technology side. You saw it publicly come out in the debate over H-1B visas in December. So we're not sure what's going to happen there. And then there's people like Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz are traditionally China hawks. In their previous positions in Congress, they were people trying to cut off ties with China and immigration from China. So we're just not sure where all of that is going to balance. And again, that comes up against Congress, where both sides of the aisle have concern about this, although a pretty wide variety of opinion on what to do about it. I will say that certainly every year of the almost 8 years I've been on the job, we had to fight against proposals to both ban Chinese students and to ban research collaborations with China. We always succeeded. We were helped actually by staff from both parties in killing those provisions, but every year somebody proposed them. Example is Congressman Jim Banks, who's now Senator Jim Banks from Indiana, has been one of the people who's been a proponent of that. You heard Senator Risch. But I should say, one of the things that Senator Risch said, while it wouldn't be said the same way, this concern that, and he did qualify it a little, but the concern that everyone from China could be used as a spy, not that they intend to be a spy. We've heard that from very senior, moderate Democrats as well. They're not willing to, unlike Risch, they're not willing to cut off the flow of Chinese students to the US. But this idea that the Chinese government holds, as a threat to anybody who has family in China, whether they intend to do anything illicit or not, is again a concern that, legitimate or not, that crosses the political divide. So what are we actually concerned about in terms of policy right now? So none of these will surprise you. I've referenced them and what Gang has, right? So one is, there is the concern about the China initiative. It is surprising in a way that they haven't reestablished it yet, given that Republicans in Congress, in the House, it didn't get into law. It did pass the bill that Gang mentioned. So will excess prosecution happen again? What the Biden administration says, as Gang noted, we're getting rid of this program. And the substantive change was, to the extent that some of these things are relatively innocent mistakes, we'll get them fixed, but we're not going to go after them as criminal prosecutions. So we'll see what happens with that. The two even bigger things are visas. We know that the administration, at least elements of it, are not fond of immigration really of any flavor, although Trump himself goes back and forth on how he feels about legal immigration. There are these factions, again, in the White House and Congress who have long wanted to cut it off. Just the day-to-day operation of things can be made more difficult. Consul officers in embassies tend to err on the side of whichever direction the administration wants to be. So right now, they're going to err on the side of denying visas. Customs and Border Patrol also are going to err and even have probably a stronger personal desire to err on the side of caution. So there could be more problems with entry. We don't know what's going to happen with, again, I mentioned H-1B visas. Universities actually have, unlike industry, no cap on the number of H-1B visas they can use. That can change. OPT, other things that allow students to stay here. So we don't know. And we know those are going to be fights. We don't know exactly who's going to be on which side and how much flexibility. Universities, for decades, not just MIT, are totally dependent on Chinese students for graduate students in the STEM fields. And that's true at MIT, where we make the point, unlike these big Midwestern schools, we are not using Chinese or any foreign students as a revenue source. And we don't have many, relatively few foreign undergrads. The third issue, so China initiative, immigration. The third is research collaboration, which I think is more vulnerable. I was saying the other night, I think we'll see if we win it, but it's not hard at all to make the argument for why the US is a net beneficiary from having Chinese students. There's the general notion of the brain gain that Gang talked about. There's the fact that most foreign students, Chinese students, actually remain in the US, and more would if we made that easier and more welcoming. And obviously, we're benefiting from that talent. So that's, I'm not saying we'll necessarily win that argument, but it's not a hard argument to make. The one on research collaboration is a little harder. It's a little less tangible. Who's gaining from what? There's no question that earlier on China was gaining more. Now there are certainly fields where China is ahead of us. Will they actually cooperate in those fields? So this question of whether research collaboration should go on is up for grabs. There are other sub-areas of that. Will the government impose more requirements saying you can't have Chinese students on such and such a research project? Will there be publication limits, et cetera? But there will be this question of whether collaboration should be cut off, period, even though the US researchers, the country they collaborate most with actually is China in fields like AI. So that's a concern. Again, we've tended to argue, we universities, over the years, just by saying international collaboration is good, the science is open, that benefits everybody. Those kind of arguments really alone are not going to hold enough water. So I will say that MIT is probably in a better position than most other, maybe any other US university on these issues. First of all, we have credibility just being a research powerhouse and not are viewed as a soft-minded liberal arts place. I say this as someone who likes the liberal arts and came from there, but we're in a better position to argue than, say, our friends up the river. But more importantly, it's steps that MIT has actually taken. So we were one of the first universities, Maria Zuber's in the back, she was the one largely responsible for this, to cut ties with Huawei because of information we were given that seemed to make that the right thing to do. We created the elevated risk process, senior risk group review for all Chinese and Saudi and Russian at the time proposals, and really started looking at those more closely. And then in November 2022, the China report that Yasheng and I were both involved with, that Richard Lester and Lily Tsai chaired, really has been seen as a model, both in the US and elsewhere. We get questions often about it from universities trying to model that. And so we actually went from being one of the most vulnerable institutions on China issues because we got a lot of money from China to the least and being viewed as a model. That's always a little precarious, but that's held us in good stead and hopefully can enable us to argue forcefully against proposals that we think are problematic. So one last point, which is one aspect that the overall context that I've mentioned creates is that one of the strongest arguments universities can make now for why to keep funding in an era when we're under suspicion by a lot of members of Congress and the administration for all sorts of reasons, legitimate and mostly not, and research funding is likely to be cut, not because it's being targeted directly, but just because the overall budget is likely to be squeezed and research will be squeezed along with it. One of the strongest arguments we can make to, don't attack us and do fund research is because of the need to compete, the need for the US to compete with China. That's sort of one of the most potent arguments. But the flip side of that is then you hear, okay, that's fine, but if we're giving you money so that you can compete with China, we better be really, really sure that it's not China that is benefiting from it. So it's a real double-edged sword that's going to bring these issues together. So hopefully we'll have a lot of discussion, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
I just wanted to say there are several seats in the front, so whoever's standing, please. All right, Yasheng, would you like to?
So let me start with the collaboration piece, which is most vulnerable, as David pointed out. But one could make the argument that those collaborations are the mechanisms to potentially deliver the most immediate value to both countries. One example is disease monitoring. So when we talk about collaborations, we can think about collaborations as research collaborations, but there's also informational collaboration, right? So even in 2020, during the Wuhan outbreak of the virus, there was still some residual collaboration between China and the United States. CDC still had personnel on the ground to monitor disease, to monitor FDA, for example. We collaborated with FDA both on the Chinese side and the American side. There were people monitoring food diseases. So China is known for having lots of those issues, and if we completely move away from that type of collaboration, we may find out to pay a huge price. And the other relevant point about the collaboration is that Biden administration renewed the US-China Science and Technology Agreement as the Biden was leaving the office, right? So it came up for renewal in August 2023, and the administration renewed it for 5 months and then another 5 months, and then they kind of let the agreement lapse. From what I knew, talking to the administration officials in charge of the negotiation with China, they negotiated hard with the Chinese counterpart about the scope of collaboration. So before it was much more broad and not very well defined, but the scope that they were able to negotiate with their Chinese counterpart was much well defined, focusing on public health, focusing on climate change. Arguably, that those type of collaborations would benefit both countries, and with many minimum implications for national security. But that's obviously subject to debate. The Senator Rich's comment about Chinese students being spies, it seemed very interesting in the political discussions on spying. People don't make a careful distinction between two kinds of intelligence, not intelligence, but spying, quote and unquote. One is spying on America, right? So spying on the IP created in the United States. And there people don't make a distinction between the intellectual property created in the university, intellectual property created in the corporate sector. And people don't make a careful distinction between that type of spying, if we call it spying, and spying on the part of the Chinese students on each other, right? So very often people, when this topic comes up, the politicians talk about Chinese students monitoring other Chinese students, reporting words and opinions on the part of the Chinese students to the Chinese embassy. That's more of a free speech issue, right? And whether or not you call it spying, it's a little bit ambiguous. So I just find out in this type of discussions, there are a lot of these things being thrown around without an effort to define what the issues are. I mean, in the newspapers and in social media, that's probably okay. But when you translate that type of vague views into policies, into legislative acts, we have a big problem, right? And so I kind of worry about starting with a very yield-defined ideas about what these things are and try to translate those things into policy. And Gang shows the CHIPS Act, right? So precisely that kind of language reflects the broader vagueness and the broad scope of the political discussions, right? So almost everything falls into that category. The other thing I want to comment on, this is built on Gang's presentation. Gang and I are involved in this NGO to work with Chinese American scientists, not just Chinese American scientists, but Asian American scientists. And we pay attention to open science, fundamental research, and to the civil rights of Chinese Americans and Chinese American scientists. In this work, I have come across two types of universities. One is MIT, and MIT is rather lonely in that category, which is that MIT actively defends its faculty. We're very lonely in that type of behavior. The more typical behavior is the University of Kansas, which throws its faculty under the bus, right? And so the professor there who was, as Gang mentioned, who was the professor persecuted under the China Initiative, we believe in the idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. The University of Kansas fired him even before the case had a resolution, right? I mean, that's just incredible, just like that. And in the end, he was found innocent, and then the university refused to give him back the job that he had. There are many, many universities, and I feel very ashamed as a professor to find out that so many universities quickly folded under the pressures from the federal government, and they don't defend their faculty. And this is, to me, outrageous. And you know, I'm not saying that everything that their faculty have done is you know, there are some issues and all of that, but to act before the court system has made a decision, to me, it's just incredible, right? It's just absolutely incredible.
And that professor is suing them.
Well, so I think legitimately, right? But there are other universities that have done similar acts with impunity. So one of the things that has happened, you know, including really prominent universities, we're not talking about, you know, universities that operate under the radar. There are prominent universities that have put a lot of pressures on not tenure-line faculty born and raised in China, but on researchers, force them to leave. And so the chart that Gang shows that China has been gaining in terms of the scientific talents, partially is because of that program. So they force them to leave on the condition that they won't take them to the next legal process, right? So there are many, many universities that have done that. The other related issue here is that there's a failure to, or lack of willingness to recognize that now the federal government, under the previous Trump administration, under China Initiative, went after the faculty at the time when the geopolitics between China and US has changed dramatically. It used to be the case that universities and federal agencies encouraged collaborations between China and the US. So the Chinese American faculty were encouraged to cultivate relationships and to collaborate with Chinese colleagues. It is not because of the Chinese American faculty that the geopolitical situation changed, right? I mean, Xi Jinping definitely has a big part in this, but since this is not a seminar about China, let me just leave it at that level. For sure, but that's not because of us. I mean, we, at least we didn't have that kind of power to make that kind of change. But we retroactively go after the Chinese American faculty using the current policy standard, using the current geopolitical situation, to go after the Chinese American faculty for the things that they did under the previous policy regime, right? To me, this is a big problem. And I think a more responsible policy should be that this is a new situation, this is a new geopolitical environment. We should think about collaborations differently. I can quite understand. We can have a debate where to draw the line, but at least to me, that's an intellectually legitimate discussion to have. The other issue is that under the China Initiative, and it may come back, under the China Initiative, the federal government criminalized research conduct that had some probably problematic features, right? So as we all know, the federal grant disclosure rules were not that straightforward, were complicated, and for years and years, it wasn't a salient issue, between researchers and the federal government, right? So, I mean, I can support a policy of tightening up the disclosure requirements. But I think it's fundamentally wrong to criminalize an issue that should have been an administrative issue, right? Rather than a criminal issue. So let me just close there by saying that, let me just conclude by saying that I deeply worry about the comeback of the China Initiative. And this time around, it is going to be worse than the previous one for two reasons, quickly. I will just say it quickly. One is that it's coming back as a legislative act rather than as an administrative act. The other is that, unlike Trump 1.0, as we know in the last 3 weeks, there are just so many things happening, right? So during the Trump 1.0, there was a Muslim ban, there was China Initiative. So these are kind of sequentially events, sequentially ordered events. But now so many things are coming at us at the same time. I don't think China Initiative is going to be very high on the attention span of the politicians who may disagree with it, right? Because there are just so many other things coming at us. Okay,
Thank you.
Finished. Yeah.
So thank you so much. This was a terrific set of presentations, very rich, basically covering everything from how to be a professional in such a contested geopolitical context where science is actually a high-risk profession, how to deal with many changing aspects of the current policy agenda, and also how to do the best science, which is why MIT is here, and how we can actually do our mission in this time. So I wanted to follow up on the slide that Gang, you showed about the power symmetry, and you had this slide where government was in big print, and then universities, and then faculty. One thing I was kind of missing from that slide is the question of where the professional organizations are. And I know both of you are very entrepreneurial in terms of trying to address this issue in terms of Chinese Americans, but do you feel that there is broader support with the, let's say, Association of University Professors, or what is the larger environment of scientific community and professional organizations, and where do you see barriers in these organizations in a way being able to reach consensus and stand up for some of the professional standards that can help Chinese Americans, but also China-focused scientists work in a more safe environment? So maybe if you want to respond, and then whoever wants to engage.
First, I think I'm pretty sure a lot of professional organizations are doing a lot of work in the background. And personally, I'm a little bit disappointed that those organizations have not go public, unified, have a unified back, as a front to push back. And I know we've been working with the AAU, AAPU through this nonprofit, and they're doing a lot of work for sure, but we don't see many public pushback. And if I put this more at the personal level, right? After I was arrested, and of course the MIT stood up, right? The only other organization that actually publicly pushed back was the American Physics Society, right? American Physics Society presidents and their current, future, and past presidents and the CEO wrote a letter, open letter to DOJ. And I'm sure other organizations done work in the background. Of course, some nonprofit that stood up. But really, we need to have this public voice and public support, right? In my case, the fact that MIT goes public really changed the narrative, right? Change the media, change the narrative, and that saved me, and really played a very important role in determination of the China Initiative. So that's more personal view. Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to echo what Gang said. In Gang's case, if MIT and MIT faculty didn't go public, the narrative in the media that emerged immediately after Gang's arrest was, I remember very vividly, the Boston Globe, New York Times, the narrative was, this is another example of Chinese intelligence operations and stealing American IP and all of that. And then after the MIT faculty spoke up, and after the facts that emerged, that, for example, shows that one of the charges against Gang was that he didn't disclose a collaborative agreement with a Chinese university. Gang was negotiating with that university on behalf of MIT, and then the whole collaboration was disclosed on the website of MIT, right? So if you disclose something on the website, I kind of consider that as a disclosure. And so there was just some rudimentary basic mistakes. And then the media began to change its narrative pretty quickly. So I shared Gang's disappointment with many, many other professional organizations. And also, amazingly, when we had conversations with members of the Congress, it was really just Chinese American members of Congress who became concerned about this. And there was some other, James Raskin was just fantastic. But other than a few Chinese American members of Congress and Representative Raskin, we didn't really get much attention. So maybe we didn't use the right strategy, maybe we didn't use the right language. Maybe one tactic should be describing this as a cost and a harm to American economy, American society. But just in terms of automatic triggering some sort of concerns about civil rights, and we didn't really see much resonance on that.
So can I, a couple of things. So on the one hand, that's true. On the other, it was really solely the work of Asian American groups that led to the reversal of the China initiative. The administration, I think, because again, there is this sense of both politically and substantively that there are real issues with China, and they really, were unsure what to do. As Guy mentioned, Matt Olson not sure exactly how to handle this. We know this from actual conversations. And it was really because of the pressure from Asian American groups and the concern about the discrimination that they shut it down, at least with that name, and also started, in line with what Yasheng said, not treating as criminal every kind of problem that existed. And that'll be tested. That bill that would have statutorily started the China initiative up, it didn't pass the full Congress. We'll see if it comes up again. At about 30 Democrats voting for it last time. Most Democrats voted no. We'll see if there's still that kind of partisan divide. The only other thing I'd say, there are issues that it's better to fight publicly and issues that you're more effective behind the scenes. I think Yasheng's absolutely right. On the Gang issue, it would have made a big difference if that had been fought privately, especially because the collaboration that Gang was partly accused of had been announced at the time it had occurred. In fact, it was one of the first press releases on China cooperation I was involved in, if I remember. But there are other things. So, for example, a lot of the work that AAU, the Association of American Universities, has done, and a lot with us, actually, on blocking particular legislation, sometimes by just trying to kill it, sometimes by offering alternatives. Most of that was done behind the scenes and actually would have been harder to do in public. And in fact, that I don't remember, it's this provision, because weirdly there were two in Chips and Science about malign foreign talent programs. We were involved in cleaning that up. And for example, there is a provision in there. It's still a mess, admittedly. You can't define things too exactly, or you're going to end up with a list and so forth. But we got in a provision, for example, that explicitly says, because of some of the problems that had come up, you are allowed to write a recommendation for someone that you actually know. That's in the law explicitly, because that was something we were able to do behind the scenes.
So let me move toward another topic. So I think all of you mentioned in some way policy attention and China initiative. So I was watching all of the Senate hearings for Marco Rubio, for example, and it's very clear that the US engagement with foreign countries needs to answer three questions. Does it make America safe? Does it make America stronger? And does it make America more prosperous? So when we are thinking about engaging with China, if there is no policy attention, if there is complete decoupling, what is the biggest risk that you foresee? Like, for example, let's say there is absolutely zero cooperation on science, that there is complete decoupling. How is it bad for American people? What is your biggest concern for American people if we don't have that? And with that also, it seems to me that China initiative was run by Department of Justice, right? Mm-hmm. And right now there are elements of effort to basically deal with China across other departments. Sure. And Department of Justice is focused now on the migration issues and on like cartels, and so there are a lot of different priorities. So how do you see this question of policy attention and priorities, and basically what are the risks if there is actually the worst case scenario when there is basically no? So
maybe I can start with that. So, I mean, the government's a big government. I mean, the DOJ has, it has security divisions and tax and criminal mm-hmm. and civil rights and antitrust. And it's not like there's ever a time where it's focused just on one area. There may be areas that get the bulk of political attention or the bulk of press attention, but this is going to be one of the areas. I don't think there's an issue about mm-hmm. Policy focus in terms of what they do day to day. Whether it will be responded to might be an issue of policy focus, as Yasheng rightly said. So I don't think that that's so much an issue. I will also say that, I mean, here, especially tonight, because of Gang's horrifying experience, we're focused on the China initiative. I suspect even for people who proposed mm-hmm. that law, if you got them to talk about China policy, it would take them a while to get to the China initiative, right? So it's looming larger here, and I'm not saying it's not important or that it wouldn't be noticed, but we're focusing on it maybe disproportionately in comparison with the public and the politicians overall. I think, the concern about what happens if what we would view as the worst case scenario. I mean, that's what we try to use to make this argument all the time. Again, without Chinese students, we're denying ourselves enormous amounts of talent and people who stay and become important parts of the US economy and US national security and just the diversity of the US. And so I think that's a real danger. We're already worried that, again, partly because of things that China is doing and partly because of things we're doing, that we're not getting always the best, not that we're getting not students that aren't good, but the very best students who once would have come to the US are now staying in China or going elsewhere, and our allied nations are competing for the ones that are allowed to leave. UK, Canada, they all have programs that are just hoping we trip ourselves up like this, right? I mean, what would have happened to US science if we hadn't taken in refugees from Nazi Germany in the 30s? I mean, there wouldn't even be a US science establishment of the kind that we have now. On the collaboration, again, it's harder to know, but especially as collaboration advances science, China is offering a lot more than it once could have, so we're going to lose out. And the other argument I'll finish with this, the other argument that's often used is we deny ourselves a window into what's happening in China, right? If everything gets cut off, we're just guessing. We're going back to the period of like having Kremlinologists just guessing what a government and nation are doing. And that's one way you get unpleasant surprises.
Yeah, so in terms of the potential losses, I think if we think about decoupling in two ways, one is economic decoupling, and there's more recognition of if we completely disengage from China at the economic level, then supply chain prices are going to be affected rather severely. We would stretch it over a long period of time. That's a different situation. But, my view that the Biden administration, for example, kept the Trump tariff on Chinese goods, I thought that was, from an economic perspective, very unwise. And inflation was a big problem, and Harris paid the price for it. But the difference between academic engagement and economic engagement is that in economic engagement is actually harder to disengage quickly, right? So you just don't stop a factory just like that, right? So it's more of a continuous operation. Whereas academic engagement is more of a binary. You make a decision, do you want to collaborate with your Chinese colleagues? Do you want to write a paper with Chinese? Each decision is binary. There's some codependency and path dependency, but arguably compared with the economic engagement, it's easier to disengage. I suspect that MIT today doesn't have a lot of active research collaborations with China compared with 5 years ago and 6 years ago, right? Whereas US as a whole still has a lot of trade with China, right? So the academic engagement goes first. And I think going after Gang, going after others, is really the Chinese, sort of a Chinese strategy of killing the chicken to scare off the monkeys, right? And so essentially, China initiative has succeeded. If the intention is not to, go after Gang personally, but they have stopped academic engagement, a lot of academic engagements between China and the United States. University of Michigan just announced that they are going to stop their collaboration with Shanghai Jiaotong University, right? So it has succeeded. And I think the price that we pay, I agree with David when he was talking about those issues that would happen when we disengage. But one characteristic of doing science today is that science today requires both more capital and more human power, right? Just compare with 20 years ago and 30 years ago, there's a paper by Nick Bloom that estimates that to really do the Moore's law today, that would require 17 times as many people as compared with 1971, right? So we need more people, and the American educational system, even at its best, and I'm not sure it's going to be at its best in the next 4 years, they are thinking of abolishing Department of Education. And even at its best, it's probably not sufficient to supply the total amount of human capital that is required to do all these incredible science and technology. Milton Friedman famously said that science is a result of millions and millions of individuals. I mean, we think about science as done by a few scientists and science professors, but underneath that, there's a whole apparatus of scientific enterprise, right? So compared with social science, you can have 3 co-authors and 4 co-authors. natural science paper is going to have 20, 30, right? So it's just that the amount of human power required. And China, for whatever reasons, supplies a large proportion of that scientific human capital because not many of them study Greek history. I would argue studying Greek history is actually helpful, but that's a separate discussion, right? So there are a higher proportion of Chinese college students who major in mathematics and engineering as compared with American undergrads. That's just a fact. And to radically move away from China in terms of the supply of the human capital, that is going to hurt us. That's going to not only hurt America, it's going to hurt science as a human activity because we are still the most productive system in terms of producing science. If we don't have enough people to do it, then we are undermining the entire scientific enterprise for the whole world, not just for America.
Just any final thoughts on that topic, and then I would like to open for questions.
Yeah. So I just gave a few anecdotal to enforce what's said. And say, when before we established a collaboration with Shenzhen Southern University of Science and Technology, I brought a group of faculty to visit the Foxconn, right? And this is a Foxconn factory at one place. At that time of our visit, there are over 200,000 people, right, in one place, one factory. And then think about logistics. So faculty say, we have to bring our students here to look at the manufacturing, right? And then we teach, mechanical engineering, we teach manufacturing. And so since then, after we established collaboration, went to BYD, went to DJI. And that's it's very beneficial for students. And the other anecdotal is, say, 10 years ago, right, before that, I really thought the China in terms of basic research was far behind. And 10 years ago, I went to a conference with chemistry, and I was really impressed how far they have caught up. And last year, I was in Shanghai, and I attended the conference, and this is more engineering side. And I would say they do better in the applied, right? So the table could turn around, and we are losing a lot of that. And so I think that's not the right approach.
Thank you. So let us turn to the questions. Do we have anybody with a question? Yes, please.
I have a question. Looking at this situation from the point of view of China, one hears that there is a growing reluctance on the part of Chinese universities and Chinese scientists to actually work with Americans, that that there's a stigma attached to it, that the university presidents now who have studies in the United States are being relegated to lower positions, et cetera. And I wonder what you could tell us about how the story looks from the other side, what you understand from your Chinese colleagues about how the story looks from their point of view.
Thank you so much for the question. So are Chinese universities more reluctant to work with US universities? And do we have any examples or evidence in that regard?
So I would say a little bit about this. I think universities in China are still willing to work with American universities. I think in the last year or so, there has been a change in the way that the Chinese government is communicating with their organizations in terms of collaborating with the US. We are receiving more inquiries and requests to meet with us, to collaborate with us, as compared with a few years ago. I think quietly the Chinese government is, I think, walking down from this very hostile rhetoric about the United States. We can go into that. I think there are some really legitimate reasons why they should be doing this. But what we have heard, at least what I have heard from Chinese families, is that they don't consider U.S. as safe for their children. They don't think that the border, so Chinese American faculty went through the border, the place of terror. The Chinese scholars and Chinese students are also subject to hours and hours of interrogations. By the way, they have interrogated not just Chinese scientists, but they have interrogated many Chinese social scientists, right? So America now has this image of not being safe because of all these horror stories that have been circulated. And there's a political incentive to exaggerate some of these things, right? So some of the stories are exaggerated, but the truth is that we have become less safe, and we have interrogated Chinese students and Chinese scholars, including our own faculty, right? So the argument is, it's hard to say that this is phantom fear. So researching in fear, they also travel in America in fear. And they also don't believe that America is hospitable to them after they graduate. U.S. has been viewed as the place to stay to do research. In the survey that our organization did on Chinese American scientists, one finding is quite striking, which is that even the young PhD students of Chinese origin fear for their future. Many of them don't view U.S. as the first place to work after they graduate. The reason why this is important is because, first of all, these are the future of the science. They are the young people. Secondly, this is purely psychological because these people don't have the PI status. By definition, they don't have this history of complicated issues in terms of collaborations with China. They have never done anything like that. Even these people have this kind of fear.
Any more questions? Yes.
Entrepreneurship and innovation in China, do you see that changing also? Because we talk about research, a lot of research comes out of universities that spark companies, and a lot of students are thinking this is my way to make a difference, but you need collaborations. Do you think that will be affected too, in terms of looking at like Kendall Square area that may be in Chengdu or in Shanghai?
So are there changes in entrepreneurship and innovation? I don't know if, Gang, maybe you want to start?
I guess to say, I just want to share, this is all anecdotal. And the other day I was talking to students, my own students, and they say we can't buy this material because of the supply chain problem. Because this is a normal material, lithium chloride, it's salt. And they say we have to wait half a year, right? So one of the, I was involved in the startup, and one difference, right? So at the time, at least this was about 10 years ago. And the startup here, they say, we wait for 3 months to get a mold made, right? This is in Wuhan. And then they went to Shanghai at a subsidiary, and they made it in less than just a few days, right? So there is this, a lot of small startup companies actually rely on the supply from China. And now with all those delays and the tax, all this, I don't know. I don't know the car. Oh, I give another example. This was my former student, right? And he has a very successful company in water treatment. and they're building a lot of plants in, say, semiconductor treatment. And then they say they were asked to build, say, this huge water treatment for semiconductor, and they went to DuPont for their film membranes. And DuPont say, we can't provide you with all the other Asian supply countries. They have to go to get an example, right? To get the supply from China. This is DuPont buying film from DuPont, right? So you can see the potential impact. This is anecdotal.
I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, so the entrepreneurship, that's more a function of the Chinese business environment, economic environment, political environment. And so this is maybe we should have a separate seminar on that because it's an important topic. But just very briefly, what is very interesting about what's happening in China is that China now is rising in terms of its technology, right? DeepSeek, EVs, BYD, and all of that. But possibly at its weakest economic moment in terms of GDP growth, in terms of business startups. And so that combination of very strong technology and weak macroeconomy is really fascinating. But we can go into that.
I think we had one more question here.
Yeah. So we saw Senator Rich mentioning there that every Chinese scholar, every Chinese student is a potential spy, even if unwilling, because of the pressure that the government could apply to them. So I'm just asking, kind of, so he gets to make that statement and people hear it and they kind of accept it. What's the counter argument?
So
the counter argument that every Chinese student is a spy is
right. So there's a few, and Greg probably actually lives this more day to day than I do. But so I think there's two overall. So one is, if you look at least in terms of according to law enforcement, where the actual, this gets back to the important point Yasheng made about what's spying, right? So you can have conversations in Washington, not all of them like this, where spying can mean anything from literally stealing something to reading a paper in the library, right? So, and those might all be issues for the US, but they're not the same issue, right? And so if you look at what law enforcement cases actually brought, even with, successful cases, but even including China initiative, the problem's much more on the industrial side, which makes sense because a lot of the university stuff is open anyway, it's pre-competitive, et cetera. So the argument is, I always say part of it, the going after students is the drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost thing. We know where the students are. It's easy to find them. You want to look like you're doing something. I'm not suggesting that there's never a problem where there's not genuine concerns, whether they're legitimate or not. But the focus on students is disproportionate to the part of the problem that's from students. So that's number one. And the other part is just where, I mentioned this earlier, where's the net? Who gets the net benefit? So let's even say that what Risch, and again, privately, other senators who are less extreme in their solutions say, even let's say that that's true, who's benefiting more from the current exchange, the US or China? Or even forgetting about who's benefiting more, is there a net benefit to the US? And it seems unarguable, especially given how many people stay here. And again, we could get that to be a higher number. So I think it's not getting dragged into the, which student's family got, a knock on the door in China. It's really, on the whole, where's the biggest problem with, let's say, stealing intellectual property as opposed to gaining other kinds of knowledge, and how much is the US benefiting on the whole from it? Those, I think, are the two arguments we would use in response, and have used with one, I don't want to name him, but again, a prominent Democratic senator Raphael and I used to have these discussions. He'd say this, what are we going to do? Every Chinese student is pliable and liable regardless of how good their motives. And we would say, well, what's your answer? Because the only solution to that is not to let in anybody, and that's going to be bad for us. And that particular center would say, yeah, that's right. So that's kind of where the argument is.
So some of the wrongdoing that I know of is really about commercial, right? And so they have been, and probably that was more common than before than now. So there was a attempt to use the IP created in your lab, and then use that IP to register a company in China, commercialize the IP, develop the IP into a product. There was really more of that. I mean, I'm not saying this is the correct thing to do. Definitely not correct, right? You need to go through the licensing process. But I mean, to me, this is a big difference between doing that, and most of them were in the medical area, life science area, rather than in like nuclear weapons, something like that, right? So I think there is a difference between doing that, which we should not tolerate. We should really just investigate, and there's that, and actively spying on behalf of the Chinese government. I mean, I think the latter is there, but I just don't see that as a predominant form of the wrongdoing that as we think about it.
And can I just add one last thing on that? It's part of a much larger issue about, are we going to win this, we, the U.S., more through defense or through offense, right? You need both. I mean, you shouldn't just turn a blind eye to people taking intellectual property. But in the end, I mean, we're not going to win this just by tripping them up.
So in that sense, like, it's a glass half full and glass half empty argument. A glass half empty argument is that every student is a spy, but if you look at glass half full, like, going out argument is that every student is a potential recruit from a national security perspective, right? Anyhow, this was a wonderful, wonderful panel, and I'm tremendously grateful that you decided to join our first seminar of the season. If you're interested in our global research and policy seminars, here is to join our mailing list. I would like to thank all of you for coming. And please, who has any more questions? I know that we are at time, but if you have any more questions, please feel free to come here for an informal discussion. Thank you all. Good night.